Philip took me out to play, and my sister insisted on following. We ended up encountering some robbers, who held my sister at gunpoint as a hostage, demanding money from Philip. I will never forget Philip's expression at that moment. His eyes were filled with worry as he said to the robbers, "Can we change the hostage? She's pregnant and can't handle the stress." He looked at me and said, "Joy, I'm sorry. She's carrying my child. Can you take her place?" Half a year later, I returned from the robbers holding a big belly. Philip went crazy, asking, "Whose child is it?" I thought I knew Philip well. After all, we grew up together as childhood sweethearts. I never dreamed that one day he would say my 19-year-old sister was pregnant and ask me to take her place as a hostage. I looked at him, feeling like a fool, and asked the stupid question, "Whose child is my sister carrying?" Philip pursed his lips into a straight line, refusing to answer. The robbers laughed, saying, "It's obvious whose it is." Lighting a cigarette, he pointed to Philip, saying, "So who will be the hostage?" Philip turned his head away, refusing to look at me. I was shocked. I never imagined that the Philip I knew so well, the one who treated me like a treasure, and who never glanced at other women for my sake, would ask me to take the place of his pregnant sister. He looked at my sister with concern, telling her to be careful and not to harm the child. Then he looked at me and said, "Joy, I will definitely get you out. Endure for now, the child is innocent." Finally, he told the robbers, "Let her be the hostage, and I will leave with another, otherwise, I won't give you a single penny." Tears blurred my vision. Philip's handsome profile, which used to mesmerize me, now appeared ruthless and unforgiving. I trembled and said, "I can be the hostage. In fact, I have no choice." Philip's eyes showed no hint of emotion towards me anymore. All that emotion had shifted to my 19-year-old sister. I sniffled and asked, "Can you tell me when you got involved with my sister?" I closed my eyes, struggling to remember. Was it when I called you while you were supposedly in a meeting, but I could hear heavy breathing on the phone? Or was it on my birthday, when you had a red mark on your neck, claiming it was a mosquito bite, but wouldn't let me see it? Or was it when tears silently fell from my eyes? On my mother's death anniversary, you used to accompany me every year, but this year, you didn't answer the phone for 12 hours. There were so many moments I should have suspected you. I pounded my head in frustration, but I never once doubted him. I never doubted the man I grew up with, the man I loved to the core, would betray me. He slept with my sister, the sister I had just found out about. My sister was my father's illegitimate child, the reason my mother died of anger. After my mother's passing, she and her mother moved into our house, and were treated like family. From that day on, my father seemed to be her father more than mine. He gave her the most precious jewels, the best house, and the most genuine parental love. He told me, "Joy, don't be angry. Susan never had a father growing up, and since you had both parents, I wanted to make up for past mistakes." He seemed to forget that my sister was an illegitimate child and missing a father was normal for her. I watched as he donated to her university, arranged for her to attend, transferred company shares to her, and showered her with love. I thought only Philip would never change towards me. Philip would hold me and say, "Don't worry, once I marry you into the Fu family, everyone, including your stepmother and your sister, will have to respect you." At that time, I truly believed that Philip and I would last forever. But then my sister would faint repeatedly in front of Philip due to her fragile health, bruising her forehead, but refusing to admit pain. She would shyly ask about the fancy brands on my clothes she hadn't seen in her childhood. She would reveal the scars on her arms, quickly covering them up, pretending not to care, but ultimately breaking down in tears when prodded by Philip. Crying, she would recount being bullied and suffering from depression and self-harm due to her lack of a father, and Philip, from his initial awkward stiffness, would soften and gently comfort her. Just like now, they embraced each other, not even looking back, disappearing from my sight. It seemed definitive. I was now alone. As I watched Philip's retreating figure, a sharp pain pierced my heart. "Philip, is this your final choice?" I asked. Philip remained silent, hugging my sister tightly and disappearing from my view. Despondent, I turned to the rough-looking robber. "So, where are you taking me now?" He grinned, lighting a cigarette, his eyes shining briefly under his baseball cap. The coldness in his narrow eyes was unmistakable. I thought I was going to die, but I never expected to survive under the robber's control for half a year, until the police found us and rescued me. The robber laughed as he was arrested, looking at me one last time. In that moment, his narrow eyes were filled with amusement, and I returned home. I was greeted by my pregnant sister, stepmother, biological father, and Philip, whose eyes were clouded and uncertain. When they saw me, Philip took a step forward, staring at me. "Joy." My sister wiped her tears and said, "We were so worried about you. Couldn't eat or sleep. Everyone lost weight. Except maybe Philip. He looks worn out." Philip gently touched my shoulder, his voice hoarse. Have you suffered a lot? I shrugged off his touch and stepped back. Don't touch me, I said. Philip's eyes darkened. Joy, I know you're angry with me, but I hired detectives and mercenaries, searching everywhere for you after I returned. He said hoarsely, I thought you'd be fine. I thought as soon as I returned, wired the money, and sent people to find you, everything would be okay. But I never imagined you would disappear for so long. I've been suffering every day for these past 6 months, Joy. I hate myself. I chuckled. You hate yourself? Do you hate yourself for sleeping with your fiancé's sister? Or because you didn't wear a condom that day? Philip froze. He had never seen this side of me. Always taught to maintain a refined image. A lady who seemed almost robotic. Philip forced a smile. I know you hate me. I shook my head, walked past him towards the stairs, and said, You're mistaken. I'm keeping my distance, because I'm pregnant. Don't touch my child. What? Philip was dumbfounded. After a few seconds, he forcefully conjured up a smile. Joy, are you trying to anger me? Where did you go to get pregnant by yourself? As soon as he finished speaking, shock washed over him. Perhaps it finally dawned on him that he had left me in the hands of a dangerous man for half a year. Philip's face paled, and in a frustrated manner, he took a few steps. Joy, tell me this isn't true. I can't accept that you're pregnant. I sat on the sofa, gazing at my mother's collection of antique English china plates on the coffee table, the set she planned to give me as a dowry, now holding my sister's favorite candies. I chuckled. Why are you so surprised? Didn't you know the consequences when you turned your back on me? You can't accept my pregnancy. Well, I wonder how you felt when Susan got pregnant. I raised my hand, emptied the candies into the trash, grabbed the plate, and went upstairs, saying, Don't touch my mother's things, better not touch anything. As I ascended the stairs, my father finally reacted. Wait, explain yourself. How did you get pregnant? My stepmother chimed in. Yes, a plate isn't worth much. Set it down and explain the child in your belly. I halted, turned around to explain to them. It's the child of me and the robber. Who else could it be? I then pointed at my sister. Can't her child remain ambiguous while mine needs an explanation? My sister touched her belly, saying, Sister, it was an impulse between me and Philip back then. We didn't plan for it, but it happened. There's nothing we can do now. She looked at the plate in my hands, a hint of resentment in her eyes, as if I had taken something from her. At least my child has innocent parents. Your child. Who is the father? She sneered. I smiled at my sister. The father of my child is the best man in the world. Suddenly, the sound of something shattering filled the room. It was Philip accidentally knocking over a tea table and breaking a cup. His face drained of color as he looked at me silently. I used to claim Philip was the best man in the world, from childhood to adulthood, but Philip had thrown me into the abyss. Now that I had climbed out of that abyss, my heart had replaced him with another man. Philip began to look lost. I couldn't understand. Isn't all of this because of you? I went upstairs to my bedroom, and when I pushed open the door, I almost thought I had walked into the wrong room. The room was filled with shades of pink bedsheets, curtains, lampshades, and dressing table. Pink, a color I would never use for decoration, now overwhelmed my bedroom. This was no longer my room. This was my younger sister's room. As only she would love the color pink so much. I sighed. When my mom passed away, within 3 days, her bedroom had been completely redecorated in orange, which was my stepmother's favorite color. Even the nanny, who had raised me since childhood, was let go by my stepmother. And now, history was repeating itself, and I had nowhere to live. My sister followed me inside and said, I need sunlight, after getting pregnant. So I'll be staying in your room. Do you want me to move back? My dad shrugged off. Why bother about this between sisters? Let her stay in your room. I closed the bedroom door. I can't stay here. I'll vomit if I see disgusting things. I turned around and walked back downstairs. I'll stay at a hotel. My dad was taken aback. In the past, I would have never defied him this way. I would have just cried silently. My sister choked up. Sister, I said I can move back if you don't like it. I furrowed my brow, paused, and said, Then move. Can't you see how much I dislike it? She froze, tears trickling down her face. I made a gesture. You move. I'll wait here. I used to have a good temper, never losing my temper with anyone, thinking it was proper etiquette. But someone once told me, being too accommodating was a form of indulgence, letting others walk all over you. That person was William. He had once touched my hair, saying, Promise me, never let anyone bully you again. All right. I had promised him. So here I was, standing in the hallway, staring at my sister with teary eyes, listening to her sobs, without saying a word. She said she would make room for me. Unfortunately, before she could act, my father intervened. Your sister has been staying in this room for so long. It's too much trouble to rearrange everything. Go sleep in your sister's room. I looked at where he pointed, my sister's old room. There hung a large picture of her and Philip on the bedside, and on the wall were my dad and stepmother's wedding photo. To stay in that room and face those two pictures day and night would have driven me insane with my previous temperament. I looked at my somewhat unfamiliar father. He had once lifted me like a little princess, and said I was his everything, but unfortunately, love in a family could change without warning. I turned around and went back downstairs, unattached. I'll stay at the hotel. My dad called after me. You haven't figured out what to do with the baby in your belly. Then I heard him scold me. It's just a room. Can't you let your sister have it? How were you taught by your mother? So petty. Scolding me was one thing, but why mention my mother? Bring up my mother who worked hard alongside him from nothing and endured difficult times. I turned back, squinted, and said, if I were you, I'd have your daughter pack her bags now. By noon tomorrow, she'll definitely be moving out. With that, I left the house, a place that could no longer be called home. As I walked out through the carved gate, footsteps followed behind me. It was Philip catching up. He grabbed my arm. Is it worth leaving because of a room? I looked at him. What's it to you? What relation are you to me? Philip hesitated, but still held onto my arm. Is the baby in your belly real? It's making me uncomfortable. I was irritated and took out the ultrasound report from my bag. Look for yourself, quick, look, and then I'm taking a taxi. Philip recoiled as if the paper was a wild beast. He gripped my arm tightly, causing me pain. I winced and pulled my arm away, keeping the report, and called for a cab. Philip's face turned pale as he stood beside me. Joy, how did this happen? You must be mistaken. Shaking my head, I interrupted him. I'm done with the drama. Raising my hand, I released his grip and asked, by what authority are you asking me to abort? Philip, are you my brother-in-law? Philip fell silent. I let go of his hand, closed the cab door, and left. I lay on the hotel's large bed, thinking about the room that had been taken from me. It was the best room in the entire villa, with the best lighting and views. Every detail was a reflection of my mother's love for me, and now, it had been snatched away. Looking out into the dark night, I remembered a story someone once told me at night. It was the second night after being abandoned by Philip, taken by the kidnappers to the mountains, that a man named William told me a story. He tossed me a chicken leg. Stop crying. It's just a man being stolen. I was in too much grief and forgot to be scared, and blurted out, easy for you to say. Do you know how much pain I'm in? William laughed and sat next to me, lighting a cigarette. I haven't been stolen before, but once my meal was taken. He raised the chicken leg. I was homeless on the streets. Hadn't eaten in a week. That chicken leg was given to me by a kind person, but it was stolen. If I didn't get it back, I would starve to death. In my first 23 years, I had never heard of such a life. I was shocked and stopped crying, listening to him quietly. I was afraid. I wasn't even an adult yet. And that homeless man was too big. I hadn't eaten in a week, because everything I had was taken by him. I knew I couldn't beat him, but I didn't want to starve to death, or be robbed again. So I jumped on him, clinging to his ear with all my might, regardless of how he pushed me against the wall, hitting me until I saw stars. I bit him with one thought in mind. I have to survive. I was stunned, forgot about Philip's matter, and asked him, what happened then? William tore off a piece of chicken, chewed it slowly, and said, smiling, between the two of us, I survived. From then on, no one dared to take anything from me again. Taking a bite, I felt the already cold chicken leg in my hand, and now, after half a year, I was suddenly craving chicken leg. Before ordering takeout, I texted my dad, restore my bedroom to its original state by tomorrow noon, or I'll liquidate all mom's stocks. Within 2 seconds, my dad began calling me frantically. I ignored every call, put my phone on silent, ate the chicken leg, went to bed, and waited for the next day to inspect my bedroom. I had inherited all of my mom's shares from my mother's hands, and my dad had been in a frenzy, not coming home for several nights. But my mother had completed all the formalities before her departure. If I decided to cash in, it wouldn't bankrupt my dad's company, but the damage would take at least 5 years to recover from. My dad saw that I wasn't answering the phone and messaged me. You used to be so obedient. Have you forgotten? You're breaking your father's heart. Because I was obedient, my room was taken, my father was taken, and my fiancé was taken. This time, I decided not to be obedient anymore. Seeing my lack of response, my dad sent multiple voice messages, each 60 seconds long. I opened one, and it was my dad cursing furiously. I closed it, Googled how to liquidate shares, and sent a screenshot to my dad. He stopped cursing. After a few seconds, he messaged, come over tomorrow at noon. The next day, I got up early and went to see Mary, my auntie. I hadn't seen Mary in a long time. She was a major shareholder in my father's company. When my father had financial problems, seeking out investors far and wide, no one responded. It was my mother who befriended Mary, sweet-talking her into investing. Over the years, Mary became a good friend of my mother's. Unfortunately, before her passing, she had been depressed and didn't want to see anyone. So Mary didn't know what had happened between my parents. When she found out later, my stepmother and sister had already taken over the house, and I was under my father's control, not even allowed to answer Mary's calls. Thinking back to my old self, even a block of tofu was tougher than me. If I hadn't been taken away. If I hadn't realized some things during life and death, if William hadn't shown me another possibility for life, I might have been bullied to death without anyone caring. Aunt Mary's eyes turned red when she saw me. Your dad doesn't allow you to contact me, does he? I nodded. Tears streamed down my face. Tears that hadn't stopped since I returned. Some accounts need to be settled. At noon, I walked into my bedroom on time and marveled in my heart. My exquisite decorations, clean beddings, even the flowers on my terrace and the chaise lounge, were perfectly restored. I turned to my father and nodded. Well done. It seems you're really afraid of me dumping the stocks. My father's face darkened, and my stepmother intervened. Joy, what are you saying? You're so thoughtless. Your father even wanted to throw a banquet to rid us of bad luck. I was initially casually looking at my newly trimmed fingernails, but raised an eyebrow at the mention of a banquet. A banquet. All right. I'd like to attend. I glanced at my father. So you're throwing a banquet for me, huh? No wonder you didn't even spare a glance at me after I came back from being kidnapped for half a year. It turns out you wanted to surprise me. My father's face darkened, and he tried to say something, but seeing my playful expression, he gritted his teeth and nodded. He also shot a glare at my stepmother, seemingly finding her meddling. Perhaps my stepmother hadn't expected that the previously quiet and reserved Joy would now climb so smoothly. But wait and see, there were many unexpected things to come. I looked at the bracelet on my wrist, not very eye-catching. A silver bracelet with rough craftsmanship and an unattractive design. Because it was so unremarkable, no one had noticed the rare emerald embedded in it. This was a gift from William. He carefully put it on my wrist. Tomorrow, you will return to the sunlight. Struggle, fight, claw, bite, find ways to take back what's yours. Then stand on top of them, looking down on them. He solemnly placed the bracelet, his father's life-saving item that he hadn't sold even when he was starving, on my hand. I touched the bracelet on my hand and urged my father. What's wrong, Dad? Don't know who to invite for the banquet. Let me help you think of some. I called Aunt Mary. Aunt Mary, my dad wants to throw a banquet for me. Can you help me think of who to invite? Or could you directly invite them for me? The more people, the merrier, to ward off bad luck. My father's face turned purple with anger. Joy, have you grown wings? Carrying a pregnancy without anyone knowing, yet you dare show your face. He pointed at my sister. Then how do you view my sister's stomach? My father couldn't say a word. My stepmother intervened again. The deed is done. It's pointless to dwell on it. It's better to accept reality. Let go of grudges, and wish your sister well. After all, you two are siblings. I nodded with a smile. I didn't say I wouldn't accept it. I can give Philip to Susan as a gift. I don't want him, but the banquet must go on. My father, looking at the phone in my hand with an open call page showing the name of a well-known securities broker in the city, Aunt Mary's good friend, who particularly excelled in stock cashing out, nodded disapprovingly. I had achieved my goal. Didn't want to stay with them any longer. So I locked the bedroom and went downstairs. My sister followed behind me, previously silent, with a resentful look in her eyes. But as we got closer to the first floor, she suddenly asked me, Sister, is it true that you don't want Philip anymore and will give him to me? I waved my hand as if shooing away a fly. Who would cling to rubbish like that? If you want him, of course, I'll give him to you. You two are a perfect match. As the words left my mouth, I heard a cough. Philip was standing downstairs, tall and proud, but unable to hide the pallor on his face. The banquet was attended by many people. The cream of the crop in the city's business and social scene were invited by Aunt Mary. The grandeur of my sister's 19th birthday party, thrown by my father, was well known. People from half the commercial district in town came, with champagne towers, cake towers, and diamond car keys gifted by my father on the spot. And now, my banquet was even more grandiose. Aunt Mary recommended a party planning team to my father, renowned for their luxurious style. I knew my father was feeling the pinch. He didn't hesitate to spend the money on my sister, but for me, it was a different story. Nevertheless, I held on to the shares and demanded the outfitting fee from my father, arranging for top-tier haute couture dresses and jewelry. On the day of the banquet, in my gold fishtail gown, top-quality sapphire necklace and earrings, hair styled in vintage waves, and fiery red lips. As I stepped out, the entire room fell silent for a moment. That was followed by whispers. Is Joy really that beautiful? No one ever mentioned Joy before. Susan's beauty can only be considered second-rate. Joy is truly stunning. Amidst the low murmurs, I walked up to Philip. He looked at me quietly, a hint of astonishment in his eyes. Joy, I never knew you had this side. He gazed at my red lips and said softly. I smiled and reached out my hand to him. Shall we dance to open the floor? Philip's eyes lit up with surprise. Of course. My sister bit her lip, whispering softly, Philip, I'm feeling a bit unwell. But Philip didn't hear her. A man who would sacrifice his fiancée's life before a gun couldn't guarantee that he wouldn't think of his not-so-fresh mistress under the allure of beauty. He held me as we entered the dance floor, moving to the music. Joy, I miss holding you, Philip murmured in my ear. I smiled, making a hushing gesture with my lips, and we twirled on the dance floor, his eyes gradually filled with confusion. This was the man I had loved for so long. I leaned on his shoulder. Could you tell me about the investments in the south of the city? I'm on my own now, as you know. They say there's no harm in relying on oneself, if I can make money on my own. Philip laughed and said in my ear, sure, you can learn whatever you want. As long as you're still willing to smile at me. As the song ended, Philip and I released each other and left the dance floor. My sister's eyes reddened as she watched, looking at Philip with pleading eyes, but unfortunately, Philip never turned to her, because Aunt Mary tapped the wine glass. Everyone, I have a request, more like a decision, that I'd like to announce on this occasion. She pointed at me. This is the daughter of an old friend of mine. I and other shareholders have seen her grow up, and I had a good relationship with her mother. Today, after discussing it, we, as shareholders, are suggesting her entry into the company's management to learn. If she is to inherit the family business in the future, we are confident. The whole room was stunned. I smiled, walked up to Aunt Mary, thanked her, and then, towering above, I looked at my father's confusion and my sister's resentment. When my sister wanted to enter the company before, she didn't want to start from the bottom and wanted to be directly appointed as the general manager. But Aunt Mary and the shareholders stopped her. Aunt Mary said she wasn't comfortable with such a person entering the management level. But now, this unfavored daughter of mine was being strongly recommended by her. I looked at my angry stepmother and biological mother's eyes, giving them an even more radiant smile. I had no choice. Who made my father penniless? And it was my mother who struggled with him. Those shares my mother held could truly hurt his pride. The relationships my mother maintained on his behalf also had intimidating power over him. It was a pity that, like my mother, I had never thought I could leverage my resources in this way before. The banquet hall played melodious music, and amidst my father's anger, I laughed freely, danced, and socialized without reservation, doing things that the previous introverted Joy would never have done. I became the most stunning presence of the evening, captivating Philip's attention. My sister was trembling with anger, constantly complaining to my father and shedding tears. But Aunt Mary had a chat with my father for a while, and my father wearily nodded, pushing my sister aside. As I gazed across the dance floor at the commotion, I raised my glass to my sister and took a sip of the grape juice. My sister stared at me for a moment, then suddenly walked towards me. When she reached me, she slipped, bumping into me. I stumbled for a moment, and my sister cried out, I'm sorry, sister, I didn't mean to. Is the baby in your belly okay? The first 3 months are the most critical. The banquet hall fell silent. People were talking and speculating. Is Joy pregnant? Whose child is it? I didn't know, but she did disappear for half a year. Was this half year for pregnancy? Why haven't we heard of her getting married? I shrugged, listening to the idle chatter as a form of boredom, but in my heart, I thought of the father of my child, with those shrewd, bright eyes. Back then, I cried every day, almost blinding myself with tears. At first, William would sternly tell me not to cry, but eventually, I realized he wouldn't harm me, and I cried louder. William handed me tissues in helplessness. After a while, he scratched his head. What if I take you back? The ransom is in, after all. I shook my head. I wasn't crying because I was being forced to go back with William. I cried because I truly had no home. My mother was gone, my father had become my sister's father, and Philip had become my sister's. I had no one close left. What's the point of being taken back? I had no home. I was adrift everywhere. William watched me cry quietly, and after a while, he became curious. You've reached this point. Why aren't you swearing or venting your anger? I said through sobs. A young lady should be well-mannered. Some words, regardless of the situation, should never be said. William was taken aback. After a while, he laughed heartily. No wonder you've been left with nothing, betrayed by your family, friends, and lover, with not a single one remaining by your side. I glared at him in anger, but he wiped away my tears and proceeded to tell me a story. The story was simple. It was about two good friends, one cultured and refined, the other cunning and flexible in his morals. The cultured friend used his patented technology to start a company and make money. He was willing to help his friend by sharing his success and earning together without any suspicion. However, his friend stole his patented technology and sold it to a competitor, making a fortune in the process. The cultured friend, who had always followed the rules and never expected anything other than fair competition in the world, was shocked and devastated by this betrayal. He eventually died from the distress, leaving behind a wife and a young child who ended up on the streets. In contrast, the cunning friend thrived, engaging in affairs, getting rich, and relishing in his successful life. William handed me a tissue and asked, "Do you want to be the cultured one who dies? Or do you want to fight back and live on? It's your choice, if you decide. I have time to spare and can teach you to pass the time." Clutching the tissue, I spent the night restless, pondering deeply. My mother was cultured, but it led to her demise. I was cultured, yet I was abandoned. The cultured man in the story even had his child suffer the consequences. At daybreak, with red eyes, I sought out William and declared, "I choose to fight back and live on. I want all the wrongdoers to face the consequences they deserve." As the banquet drew to a close, my father, sister, and stepmother couldn't muster a smile, but Philip kept his gaze fixed on me, observing me laugh and dance freely, engaging in conversations with various guests, while holding a glass of grape juice. I became the absolute focus and queen of the entire banquet hall. As the event ended, before my sister could approach him, Philip came up to me and asked, "May I have the honor to escort you home?" Smiling in the midst of my sister's resentment, I nodded in agreement. The night air was slightly chilly, ruffling my hair as Philip looked at me intently. He opened the car door for me to step in. I remembered when we first met. He used to open the car door for me. However, as time passed, we never walked side by side. He always led the way while I followed behind. Not once did he open the car door for me. Sitting inside the car, I waved to my sister standing behind the car, advising her to head home early and take care not to catch a cold, considering her bigger belly. Philip silently glanced at me. After driving a few kilometers, he spoke. "I remember you used to depend on me a lot. Once a wealthy heiress, I clumsily loaned to make bento boxes and carried them to Philip's company, offering him lovingly prepared meals. However, he coldly rejected me, stating, 'I don't wish to see you at work. It affects my efficiency.' This happened around the time my sister conceived. Every night, my sister was home. How did she get pregnant then?" I looked at Philip's profile, still as sharp and firm as when he first rejected me. He continued, "I heard of a syndrome called Stockholm Syndrome, where hostages develop feelings for their captors. It's abnormal and sick, Joy. Let me take you to see a doctor." His frantic attempts to find excuses convinced him that my feelings for William were not genuine. Maintaining a smile, I observed his lips moving, his Adam's apple rolling, refraining from arguing or agreeing, as deep within me, I knew the true sickness lay in committing adultery with a sister-in-law, pushing a fiancé into a dark abyss of the gun's barrel, and mistreating the children left behind. With the car engulfed in a deafening silence, Philip's eyes revealed a profound anguish, as I boldly declared, "I love him, very much." The serene atmosphere shattered, and Philip's expression contorted in anguish, prompting him to plead, "Please don't say that, Joy." He rubbed his temples and sighed. "I heard of a disease called Stockholm Syndrome, where hostages develop feelings for their captors. It's abnormal and sick, Joy. I'll take you to see a doctor." He tried desperately to rationalize that my affection for William was a result of illness rather than genuine love. As time passed, I engaged more frequently in business meetings with Philip, discussing projects together. Despite objections from my father, stepmother, and sister, Philip was willing to collaborate. Philip specifically requested my involvement in projects, leaving my father no choice but to begrudgingly accept. He privately expressed, "Daughter, I know you have been through a lot, from being kidnapped to pregnant. You're still the obedient child, aren't you?" Standing up with a smile, I whispered in my father's ear, "Not anymore. People change. The more honest one is, the more resolute and irreversible the change. Hence, the saying goes, don't provoke an honest person." Unfortunately, my father failed to grasp this concept. With frequent visits to Philip's office, late-night project discussions, and casual conversations, my sister, once understanding, reached her breaking point. A heated argument ensued between her and Philip, resulting in her being kicked out of the office and blocked on message. In a cold tone, my sister asked, "Are you satisfied now? Your mother can't teach you manners." While going through documents, I whistled casually, remarking, "We'll see how the tables turn." "My dear sister," derisively, my sister replied, "Don't forget I'm carrying Philip's child, while you're just a wild seed." Folding the papers, I lifted my gaze and confronted her. Hasn't your own child's origin crossed your mind? How dare you speak to me this way? Suppressing her retort, I handed her a tissue to wipe her tears, and she retaliated. Before she could finish, my hand met her cheek firmly, merely a precaution to prevent coffee stains. Left dumbfounded and red-faced, my sister retreated in tears. As I was raised by William's strict training, my slap was not just for show. Discarding the wet tissue, I cleaned my fingers meticulously, imbued with impatience. I pondered the necessity of investing time and life with such worthless individuals. Why should William end up in prison due to a meticulously planned kidnapping? Squinting my eyes, I realized that all the grievances and injustices demanded a resolution. Increasingly, I visited Philip's office for business discussions and stayed afterward for casual chats, learning about his investments and decision-making processes. When I made coffee for him with some snacks, I want to learn more from you. If I can learn half of what you know, it'll be enough for me. Philip smiled gently. Joy, how did I not realize how cute you are before? In fact, he forgot, in the first decade of knowing my sister, he had always been praising me for being cute. It's just that in the short few years since my sister arrived, he selectively forgot about me. I had become a hostage, no longer the girl he swore to cherish. But Philip did teach me a lot, explaining every decision to me in detail, and predicting the strategies of his competitors. I memorized every word meticulously. In the eyes of others, it seemed like Philip and I were reconciling. This made my sister and my stepmother anxious. But to my surprise, my dad didn't help my sister for once. I think it's because Philip offered 2 projects, shutting my dad up. As long as there was money to be made, even if Philip took turns playing with his 2 daughters, he could still rest easy while cashing in. The intimacy between Philip and me continued for a week. One day he called me, asking me to come to a private hospital. I thought he was sick and wanted me to visit, reluctantly asking my secretary to arrange a bouquet of flowers to take along. But when I got there, I realized Philip had asked me to come to the obstetrics room. Of course, I didn't think Philip was kind enough to take me for a checkup. I took a step back, throwing the flowers on the ground. What do you want? Philip's eyes showed a sense of fanaticism. Joy, I want to reclaim you. I don't want us to continue in this ambiguous state. He looked at my slightly bulging belly. I want you to belong to me again. Although I had been disappointed in Philip before, I never thought I could be even more disappointed in him. I touched my belly and said, so you want to harm my child? Without even greeting me, do you want to act first? Philip looked troubled. Joy, I can't bear to see you with Stockholm Syndrome, not knowing your true feelings. I've arranged a psychologist for you, but the child has to be aborted first. He comforted me. In the future, I will have a better child with you than this one. I covered my mouth. My child had been considerate. Since I got pregnant, I had never experienced morning sickness, but now, even my unborn child seemed disgusted. I covered my mouth and ran out, struggling not to throw up, but Philip stood in my way. Joy, go through with the procedure and then leave. If you want a child, I can give you one. Let's abort this criminal's child. I steadied my breathing, restraining the urge to vomit. I desperately told my child in my belly, baby, wait a moment, mommy has to deal with something first. My hand clenched into a fist, quickly calculating in my mind. The plan was almost complete. I didn't need to continue. I faced Philip and asked seriously, who gave you the right to say my partner is a criminal? Philip opened his mouth, but before he could speak, I punched him in the face. Blood trickled from his nose as he looked at me in astonishment. Joy, I continued by asking, and who gave you the right to say my child is a criminal's offspring? I struck him with another punch, but this time, Philip, who had practiced martial arts since childhood, managed to evade it. I grabbed his tie, wiped the blood from my knuckles. Philip, think twice before you speak. Don't be too confident. You're not money. Why should I like you? Philip pursed his lips, his mouth slightly drooping, his voice hoarse. Joy, what devil are you possessed by? You'd rather bear a criminal's child than give me a chance. I'm too lazy to give you a chance, and soon you'll regret provoking me. Walking out of the hospital, I decided to tie up loose ends. I drove home, went into my dad's study, and removed the listening devices hidden under the desk. Then I went to the company, using my managerial position, smoothly accessed my dad's office, and, during his meeting, skillfully removed the listening devices hidden under his desk. The next day, I didn't go to the company or back home, but went to a hotel. I spent 2 days liquidating all of my mom's stocks. On the 5th day, Aunt Mary withdrew her investment. My dad's company immediately faced a crisis. My dad started frantically calling and messaging me. He recalled our childhood memories, sending me a picture of us picnicking together. In the photo, my dad kissed my face, showing how close we used to be. But my dad forgot. It was my mom who took that photo. Looking at it, all I could think of was my mom. I wondered if my mom could have met someone like her own William back then, and not ended up dead. Unfortunately, there are no IFS in this world, only regrets. I sighed, took the listening devices, and started organizing all the audio recordings of my dad in the company and at home. I selected the most important ones and posted them online. The next day, the company was infamous nationwide. A certain company's president was exposed for tax evasion, illegal fundraising, and bribery. It became the top trending topic of the day. The company's stock plummeted. Shareholders demanded answers from my dad. He was devastated. He sent me a message. "You are so unfilial. Aren't you afraid of retribution?" I smiled and replied, "You're not afraid of retribution. So why should I be? There's no reason for God to spare someone like you, who drove your wife to despair, and your friends to death, while coming after me. Isn't that right, my dear father?" To make sure my dad understood, I added, "By the way, Jack sends his regards from heaven, Dad." My dad didn't respond. Eventually, he sent a few words. "How do you know Jack?" "How do I know?" I lowered my head, caressed my slightly bulging belly, and smiled. "He is the grandfather of my child, who never had the chance to meet him. He is William, the cultured and profound man whose invention was stolen by a friend and led to his death." My dad was arrested. My stepmother was involved in the crimes and was also arrested. The company couldn't sustain itself and declared bankruptcy, using all the real estate properties to repay debts. My pregnant sister was kicked out of the villa, crying as she went to find Philip, but Philip only gave her money to stay in a hotel. He didn't even let her stay at his place. He called me, "Joy, I know you must be going through a tough time right now. Don't worry. I'll take care of it." At that moment, I was negotiating with Philip's biggest rival in a coffee shop. I held a pile of documents containing all of Philip's trade secrets and core business information. Upon receiving his call, I smiled and thanked him. I replied very cheerfully, "Thank you, take care of yourself first." 3 days later, a major deal of Philip's was intercepted. A week later, his biggest business partner was poached. 3 months later, Philip's company was besieged by several competitors. Some grey news about his business started to spread, causing a stir, and banks began to withhold loans. Philip was too preoccupied to bother with me. It was only one late night, when Philip called me, his voice full of weariness. "Susan gave birth." I fell silent for a moment and then congratulated him. Memories seemed to drift back to that afternoon, the one where Philip announced Susan's pregnancy, making me a hostage, but the pain from back then was no longer there, replaced by a sense of luck. I felt lucky to have been a hostage for Susan, and Susan returning the favor by giving birth to Philip's child. Lucky that my child belonged to William. I heard Philip lighting a cigarette, exhaling smoke. "I've figured it out, Joy," he said. "The only one capable of eavesdropping on both your dad at home and in the company, and cunning enough to go against him, is you. All the leaked business secrets from our family are from your eavesdropping. All of this. It's all part of your plan." I sipped my tea, smiled and replied, "So what?" Philip fell silent, holding his breath. After a while, he coughed, bitterly smiling. "If, Joy, just if, I leave the child, ask Susan to go, would you come back?" Even though I had become desensitized towards Philip, his words still made me feel a bit nauseous. "Do you want to play the mother-son game?" I spoke as Philip's voice quivered. "Joy, believe it or not, even knowing what you did, I still want you." I regretted it. I regretted Susan getting pregnant, and letting you be taken by that man. His voice was low, despondent and melancholic. "Now your dad and your stepmother are caught. My family is on the verge of destruction. Joy, aren't you satisfied yet?" I let Susan go. "Can we start over?" I asked him in return. "Have my atonements not been enough to please you?" I swallowed my coffee, gazing at the city lights outside. Just one more year until William would be released. I and William would then have our own comforting light in this city. Envisioning the future, my mood lifted. Smiling, I said to Philip word by word, "But Philip, you're not even worthy to shine my partner's shoes." After hanging up the phone, I stood by the window, looking at the night sky, taking a deep breath. All the grudges would end here. For the rest of my life, I had William. A year later, 2 significant events occurred. My daughter was born, and William was released. When my daughter was born, Philip received the news. After my family's villa was repossessed and bought back by me, I transformed it all into the style my mom had originally designed. It is now where my daughter and I reside. I carried my daughter home, and as I got off the car, I saw Philip's car. Philip was almost starting over now. His previous glory had faded, and he had fallen on hard times, but he still had the capability, and his business was slowly recovering. My sister had a child, but she didn't become Philip's wife as intended. She kept pushing for marriage every now and then, but Philip never agreed. My sister, worn down by the pressure, had lost her tenderness, and they argued endlessly every day, causing the child to cry loudly. During the day, Philip had to navigate through the storm, trying to save his business, and at night, he had to battle with my sister. When we met again, he looked much more haggard. Seeing the child in my arms, his eyes dimmed, and he forced out a bitter smile. Even if he went to jail, I still had to bear him a child. He lowered his head. Now I believe you really loved him. I was in a rush to take my daughter home, so I just replied to him, yes. Philip smiled bitterly again. It was a smile mixed with bitterness and desolation. Seeing that I was about to close the door, he suddenly asked me, or maybe he was asking himself, if back then I hadn't been obsessed with that feeling of novelty, would this child be ours now? I shook my head. Philip, there are no ifs in this world, only impossibilities. I thought for a moment and added, but I am grateful that you chose Susan, otherwise how could I have met my true love? He staggered a bit, his face turning paler. After a while, he forced out another smile. Just a forced smile. That's good, then I won't bother anymore. I wish you a happy life. He turned around, his figure looking lonely in the sunset. Goodbye. As I watched his retreating figure, I suddenly remembered our childhood. A little Philip holding up his hand, swearing to a little me, Philip will always treat Joy well. If not, I'll be alone for the rest of my life. No one knew back then that vows were just a kind of joke. I sighed, carrying my daughter home. My dad was sentenced, my stepmother was sentenced, my sister and Philip couldn't stand each other. All the past was finally over. Next month, William was due to be released. A month later, I took my daughter to pick up William. He hugged our daughter, blinked at me, as if trying to smile. But the next moment, he suddenly started crying, holding us tightly. I hugged him back, tears wetting his shoulder. Now, I finally had a family again. My name is William, raised on the streets. Everyone said I was frighteningly cruel, but they didn't know, if I wasn't, I would have died in that showdown over a chicken leg when I was 9. Because I was ruthless. I became the top of the street food chain, because I was ruthless. During my mercenary career as an adult, I escaped death countless times. And because I was ruthless, I rose from a lone mercenary to the top echelons of a mercenary group in West Asia. At the age of 26, I finally established my foothold in this world. I watched the news from my home country, and saw the man who had cheated my father, now a respected CEO. I thought it was time for me to get revenge. After returning home, I met with friends from the streets. He didn't make it out, still engaged in illicit activities. Recently, he took on a job to help an heiress fake a kidnapping. It was said that this heiress seduced her sister's husband, got pregnant, but the husband refused to acknowledge it. In her scheme to test her brother-in-law's intentions, she decided on the fake kidnapping plan. I raised an eyebrow upon seeing the employer's name. Interesting, the daughter of that CEO. Armed with a fake gun, I went for it. For a group of people who had never been on the battlefield, a replica gun was more than enough. While they played their childish emotional games, I fought bloody battles. The stark contrast in our destinies was all because of their ungrateful father. I held no sympathy for them, especially the man, engaged to one sister, but sleeping with the other, then using his former fiancée as a shield to protect the unborn child. The elder sister was a bit naive, at such a juncture. She was still asking whose child it was. I almost laughed and couldn't resist interjecting. I can tell whose it is. She stood there, her eyes dark and watery, shimmering with uncertainty and pain, watching the man walk away with the younger sister. Her beautiful eyes dimmed instantly. The sun was setting, the sky gradually darkening, sunlight reflecting in her eyes, filled with despairing gloominess. In that moment, I distinctly felt my heart flutter. I remembered when my father passed away, and my mother left me without looking back. I was just like her, standing under the setting sun, engulfed in despair, but holding back my trembling. I recalled the results of my investigation. That man swindled my father's patent, had an affair within 2 years, and had a child. After making it big, he successfully brought his mistress and illegitimate daughter into the picture, angering his original wife and leaving a daughter unattended. Seeing the girl overwhelmed by despair in front of me, listening to my heart beating faster, I decided to give her a choice. She could choose to endure all this numbly, becoming the sacrificial lamb of the family. Then, I wouldn't mind teaching her resolve, bravery, and perseverance. I let her contemplate whether to seek revenge or remain silent. She thought all night. That night, I felt a rare sense of anxiety. Honestly, I was afraid she would choose to oppose me. The next day, when she came to see me, I almost didn't want her to reveal her decision. Thankfully, she chose to let karma catch up with the wrongdoers. So, I altered my plan. I no longer wanted to act directly. I had the man's daughter do it. Let his biological daughter be the one to send him to prison. I started training this honest yet weak girl, beginning with her physical strength. A strong physique could fortify her spirit. Seemingly fueled by a pent-up frustration, she devoted herself to the training I provided. In less than half a year, her combat skills and tracking abilities had soared to the top among ordinary people. She could hunt, kill, and endure blood splattered across her face without a hint of emotion. I firmly believed, more than love, hatred could transform a person. In idle moments, I often found myself staring at her silhouette. There were those few moments when I suddenly didn't want to return home, even though that was where I had fought so hard. For a few days, her smiling face in a wedding dress kept recurring in my dreams. Upon waking, a clear voice in my mind said, "William, you're done for. You've fallen into it." Yet another voice argued, "William, you're a mercenary raised on the streets. What right do you have to yearn for such beauty?" Every day, these conflicting voices pulled at my heart, leaving me restless, and at times, I began to avoid her, but I realized I couldn't escape. I would hear her cry in her dreams, leap up, and rush to hold her, filled with heartache. My girl, what kind of pain has she endured? As she woke up in my embrace, her eyes wet, staring straight at me, filled with trust and indescribable yearning, piercing straight through my heart. Unable to articulate who initiated it, we both leaned in for a kiss. From that day on, I had a family, someone to love. I contemplated how I could authentically stay by my girl's side. I concluded my overseas business, transferred a considerable sum of savings back home. Then, I turned myself in. I hadn't harmed anyone, and I returned the ransom to Philip. Joy insisted that it was all part of a prank orchestrated between me and him. My dedicated lawyer managed to secure a 1-year sentence for me. After a year, I could stand under the sunlight, hand in hand with my girl for the rest of our lives. And during that year, I allowed her to seek vengeance independently. I did station 2 of my men in the shadows to protect her, but to my pride, she didn't need their assistance throughout. She handled everything by herself and exacted her revenge. Soon enough, the year passed, and on the day of my release, Joy was waiting for me at the prison gate, clad in a sky blue dress, her face bare and radiant, her long hair cascading. In her arms, she held a chubby baby, big bright eyes fixed on me. As I came out, Joy handed the baby to me. "Your daughter." I could hardly put into words how I felt at that moment. Despite being in my 20s, I had spent over a decade in the harrowing streets, never daring to dream of having a family. I didn't dare to reminisce about even my deceased family members, fearing sand might cloud my vision, unable to ascertain the looming danger. That day, under the clear blue sky, bathed in warm sunlight, my beloved girl held our daughter, smiling at me as if all the hardships we endured were just a dream. The dream had ended, and for the remainder of my life, there would only be tranquility and sweetness. I shed blood, but not tears. But in that moment, my tear fell on my daughter's cheek. Cradling Joy with one hand and our daughter with the other, we walked towards our own sunshine. After twists and turns, numerous hardships, fate had finally given me a piece of candy, hadn't it?